placed. I'm best placed to talk about my own university, but I think there are broad features that are shared across the sector in the social sciences and the humanities. So the first thing, and forgive me if this is very basic, but I think I'll just cover the bases, and then you can ask more complicated questions in Q&A. There are really 4 dimensions to an application process, which is not that complex. The first is, of course, your academic record. Most institutions will require you to have had an upper second class degree minimum from your undergraduate or master's institution. Many institutions in the UK require you to have a master's before you can apply for a PhD. So it's quite rare, I think, to be able to apply directly from a BA into a PhD. That you would either do a master's level program at your own university, or you would do a master's in the UK and then move on to a PhD. So it's quite unusual now, I think, for people to jump straight from a BA into a PhD. So your MA or MSc academic record is of significant importance. Although many institutions say that the minimum is a 2:1, that requirement can vary quite sharply across institutions. I would say, for instance, that at Cambridge, it would be quite unusual for someone without a first-class degree to actually be completely competitive for funding. It doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't mean that if you have a 2:1, you shouldn't apply. As it happens, I have an upper second class. I narrowly missed a first class from Delhi University 30 years ago. I didn't study in the UK, but it hasn't held me back terribly. So I think that that's one thing to keep in mind, that you will need a substantially good academic record. And if for whatever reason there is a gap or a problem in your academic record, you can ask your referees, the people writing your recommendation letters, to explain it. So when I write recommendation letters for students at Cambridge applying to other institutions or to Cambridge, and if something went wrong, let us say their second year results were not very good, if I'm able to offer an explanation for that, for instance, a period of illness or a period where there was significant disruption to work, then a referee can explain that. So all is not lost if your academic record is not completely spotless. The second thing to say is that you will need a good writing sample or a good work sample, right? So although places look at your academic record, they don't rely on it entirely. They want to see for themselves what kind of work you're capable of. So it's extremely important, particularly if your academic record isn't entirely stellar, to send in a very good piece of work, because that will be looked at. And in some ways, I mean, I know that when I look at applications, although I glance at the transcripts, I personally place a lot more emphasis on the work that is in front of me and what mark I would give that work. So sending in a piece of writing or whatever kind of work they ask you for that is absolutely the best that you can produce, that is very important. And even if that means taking an essay that you got a good mark on and rewriting it to make it even better, do that, because that is really quite central. The third thing that is required is the bit that is least in your hands, and that is reference letters. One thing I've tried to stress to colleagues in other countries, particularly in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on, is it's not enough to give a character certificate. It isn't enough to say somebody is a good student and they are of good moral character. What institutions in the UK are looking for is a substantial account of what somebody is like as a student. How do they think? How do they interact in the classroom? Do they turn work in on time? Are they self-motivated? Do they go off and do their own research? What is the quality of their writing? What interesting things have they said? So I know this is not in your hands, but to the extent possible, pick recommendation letters from people who are not just nice to you, but who know you well and are prepared to talk in some detail about you as a student and a scholar. In recent years, I have asked students for whom I'm writing letters to give me a list of things that they would like to see included in the letter. Now, not everybody might not like that, but you can always offer to your referee a list of things that might be helpful to them as they write the letter. And I think that many people would actually welcome that because it helps them put some content into their letter. So for instance, you might want to remind your referee that you did a very good presentation last year. You might want to remind your referee that you did a particularly interesting paper on such and such topic and you got such and such mark for it. Perhaps you did that paper for another class and you can tell your referee, well, actually, I got a really good feedback on my paper in the other class. Perhaps you could mention that in your letter. So this is something to, as I said, I understand that this is not entirely in your hands, but try and pick referees who are willing to work with you on thinking about what the most substantial and honest reference might look like. Finally, and I would say that this is the single most important part of your application, and that is your research proposal. A PhD is a research degree. And the assumption when institutions admit people for a PhD degree is that they are already on the path to writing it, that they have already put substantial amounts of thinking into their research topic. They have already assessed what's out there in the field. They have some sense of what intervention they will make. They have some sense of where the field is already at, and they have some sense of research questions that have not been addressed. One of the weaknesses I have seen in some research proposals that are sent to me to look at is that they only give a topic. So let us say, and I'm just going to pick the first book on my shelf here, and that is The Selected Works of Edward Said. Now, somebody might write and say, I would like to do an assessment of the works of Edward Said. That's just a topic. That doesn't tell me very much. But if they can lay out, for instance, so suppose they say, a lot of attention has been paid to Said's Orientalism, and some attention has been paid to his work on culture and imperialism. However, his interest in critical humanism is a relatively neglected part of his work. I want to take the idea of critical humanism and think specifically about the role of philology in Said's understanding of humanism. So if you see what I just did there, I moved from a kind of level of generality to a much more specific research question. And it's very, very important that your research proposal not be just a topic or a series of ideas, but that it actually poses a very specific and doable research project, something that is ambitious, but it can still be done in a 3 or 4 year span, right? So this is the bit of your application that you should spend the most time on, right? So, because your academic record is what it is, and hopefully you will have your ducks in a row there. You will have discussed reference letters with your referees. You will work on your writing sample, of course, but the research proposal is, I would say, the number one thing that admissions committees look at. And that is the number one thing where a distinction is made between an absolutely excellent application and an average application, which might or might not make the cut. I'm going to share my screen now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what we've recommended to applicants to our program. Okay, so I want to stress that this is not necessarily the same for all programs. You should research the department you apply to as well as you possibly can. In an ideal world, you make contact with a potential supervisor. And I say this is important. It's not make or break, but it is a good thing to be able to do, because when departments make decisions about admissions and funding, one thing they have to do, that is the department has to do, is to prove to the funding body that they have the right personnel in place for that project, right? So it isn't enough for a department to say, admit me. They have to say, we have the right kind of people to supervise this person. So the more that both you and the supervisor can establish that that particular relationship makes sense, that you share a set of interests, the better it is for funding. So research the department you want to apply to. And here I would say, although, obviously there are more and less high prestige institutions, it isn't always the most sensible idea to go for the high prestige institution. There might be somebody who works very much in your field, who is in a mid-ranking institution, and it may actually make more sense for you to apply there because the fit is better. And actually, that institution is in a better place to admit you and give you funding and to see you through your PhD. Because if there isn't a supervisory fit, it becomes quite difficult for the institution to justify admission and to make the case for funding. So I'm going to now just share my screen. I'm not very good at doing this, so let me just see if it turns up. Okay, I think this is where I want to be. Okay, can you see my screen? Can someone just say yes or no?
Yes, it's visible. Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing we have suggested is that people discuss their research topic. That is simply just lay out the thinking of Edward Said, right? So that's just the research topic. Then you talk about the research context, right? This is quite important. You relate your proposed research to what already exists and comment on why your research will actually make an intervention in the field. Now, I understand that this isn't easy because we, for instance, have an under 1,000 words limit. So you don't want to go on about it at great length, but you want to be able to flag to the committee that you have thought about the research field, you know what's out there, and you know that you are going to make, well, let me put it more basically, that you are going to address a gap in the research, that you are going to address a gap in the thinking about a particular topic. And that's the next bit. And I think that is the central bit. This is your chance to show how you have arrived at your position and recognized the need for your research, where you show that it is both new and important, and how it is going to contribute to knowledge. Again, it's a difficult, the most difficult part of the task is saying this within the word limit that you are given. And that, of course, varies from department to department and institution to institution. It's quite important, I think, to say what material you are going to look at, to specify. So I'm in an English department, and I will typically need to know what specific authors and texts you're going to look at. And this may vary across fields, but certainly I think admissions committees are looking for specificity. They're looking for a sense that you're not just throwing off an application because you thought, hey, I don't know what else to do, I'm going to just throw off an application. They want evidence that you have thought about the field and that you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to do when you arrive there on day one, right? So in a sense, I think to be able to say, I can already visualize the chapters of my dissertation Everybody knows that's going to change. That's not forever, but you nonetheless have to offer some sense of having thought about the specifics, the nitty-gritty of what you're going to look at. Your methods. Now, actually, typically in an English department, we don't place too much emphasis on methodology. We tend to get a sense of methodology from both the research proposal and the writing sample. But if you're applying in the social sciences, or indeed even in history, there might be specific kinds of methodologies that departments encourage you to be using, or to show them what methodology you're using, and that depends. So if there's something particularly interesting about your methodology, so people will say to us, for instance, I'm going to use a psychoanalytic approach, or I'm going to use a combination of psychoanalysis and Marxism. So that really depends on what you think is important to show. That's really it. We talk a little bit about the sources and resources you will use if there are specific collections at the university that you're applying to, or specific institutional resources. You can certainly mention that. So I think that the one thing that we have said that is important for you to think about is asking yourself how your work might change scholarship in the field, right? So departments, when they're admitting you to a PhD, are really assessing whether you are a future scholar, whether you have it in you, not just to be a bright student or to be a student who can do a good exam or write a good term paper, but does this person have it in them to be a voice in the field? And I often stress to my own students that the most important thing that you can do in your writing and in your research proposal is to demonstrate that you have a singular voice, and that voice is one that needs to be heard in the scholarship in the future. So think of yourself when you're applying, not as a good student, but as a potential young scholar. And thinking of yourself in that way makes all the difference, because you're not just trying to demonstrate that you can get a first-class degree, but that you actually have something to offer to the field at large in the long run. Okay, I will leave that on for a couple more minutes in case people want to make notes, but I think that is broadly what I have to say. I was asked to talk about funding. Funding is a little bit more difficult. It varies from institution to institution. I know, for instance, that at Cambridge, we rank people and send them to the international funding body, whether that's the Cambridge Commonwealth Trust or the Gates Foundation. But the ultimate decision as to who gets funding isn't ours. So we will send a ranked list of people according to who we think should get funding and why they should get funding. That's not entirely in our hands. And I'm not sure whether this is the case for all departments. I suspect there are universities where departments have a little bit more control over funding for international students, but certainly mine is not one of those departments. We do our very best to make a very strong case for the people who we do want to admit, but the ultimate decisions on funding are not entirely in departmental hands. Funding bodies will often ask you for a little bit more information because what will happen for them is that a lot of very good applications will come their way, and there might be 20 stellar applications and they can only fund 7. And at that point, it becomes very important for them to say, well, what is this person going to do in the long run that gives them a little bit of an edge? And that's, I think, where you can write in a statement of purpose or an additional funding note. You can talk about things about yourself that are not necessarily directly relevant to your PhD research or directly relevant to admission, but might make a funding body take a second look at you. So what you might want to do with your life, what you have already done in extracurricular terms, whether there are specific things about your situation, where you live, the historical conditions under which you have worked and studied, or your family has emerged. These are things I think that are usefully put in the frame for funding bodies to also think about. Personally, I would also say to you one thing: think hard about whether an academic life is for you. And I'm not saying this in order to discourage you. I am saying this actually specifically with the intention of encouraging you. The thing is that doing a PhD, by and large, is worth it if you're going into academia or a cognate research field. Doing a PhD because you don't know what else to do might not be the wisest decision, and very often it is reflected. Admissions committees can pick up on the distinction between somebody who's just sort of thrown in an application and somebody who's quite focused on doing research. So ask yourself also some of the questions that an admissions committee might be asking themselves when they look at your proposal. I think that's it. These are the four basic cornerstones of any application to most institutions. There might be little differences here and there depending on field and depending on institution. But to recap, your academic record and some kind of contextualizing of the academic record, your research proposal, most important, your work sample or writing sample, second most important or equally important, and then your references, which should be substantial and knowledgeable. So those are the four things I think that make up an application. And I guess I'm happy now to take any questions. I think I'll stop the screen share now.
Thank you so very much, Professor. So we have questions. I can see Maria. Go ahead, Maria.
Now, can I just ask people if they don't mind to just kind of come on screen, because otherwise it feels a bit discombobulated, but you don't have to.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very helpful. So very quick question with regards to like the supervisor. So for instance, there are some departments at Cambridge that allow interdisciplinary research. And they do sort of advise you that you look for potential supervisors across the board from like every department whose research interest sort of matches whatever research that you want to propose. But I'm thinking about what you said with regards to methodology and how, for instance, because you are from English department, you would be interested in, just like thinking about like, what texts do I want to refer or so on. But like, for instance, I come from a political science background and I want to sort of mix a lot of like, okay, let me not like drag it a little too much, but what I'm trying to say is that when we're working on our proposals, right, and specifically with regards to the methodology, because we do want to, for instance, I want to keep it a little open-ended because I'm not 100% certain how the theoretical framework is going to be with regards to whatever research I'm proposing. But at the same time, when a certain department like asks me to look for supervisors from all departments, how does then that limit my like my potentially like mentioning like some certain supervisor could supervise, certain professor could supervise me, because I'm coming from a different departmental, like I'm entering into this like I'm coming from a different academic background and trying to sort of like go to a different, I don't know if I'm making sense.
Yeah, well, sorry, you actually reminded me of something I forgot to say, or maybe I said it in passing and didn't develop it. Ideally, you make contact with potential supervisors. So you write to people, and you can write to more than one person at an institution and say, I've looked at your work, or I know your work, or I have some sense of would you be interested in my proposal? And can I show you a copy? Okay. And at that point, if the person says yes, then in a sense, you have already developed a working relationship. And sorry, go ahead.
So sorry to interrupt, but just quickly,
Yeah.
like I'm talking very specifically about the Department of Gender Studies at Cambridge, for instance, and they very specifically mention do not contact potential like your supervisors. The center will do that on your behalf. And they say that over and over again in the emails and their websites, which is why I'm sort of wondering, then how does that sort of interdisciplinarity work? Because at the end of the day, I do want to sort of like mention certain supervisors from different departments, but then I'm also confused in terms of the methodology that I'm writing.
That's a little bit bizarre. I have to say that I did not know. I have dealt with people who have applied to that department and have been given admission, who have worked on their proposal with me and have put down my name as a potential supervisor. I hesitate to say more because this is news to me. I don't think you can be penalized for contacting a supervisor. What is true is that the department has some say in who is then assigned to you as a supervisor. So they might decide that I'm not the best supervisor. There's somebody in history who would be a better supervisor. But I don't think it can ever be a terribly bad idea to be in contact with a senior academic and say, help me figure this out.
If I may add to this about the particular gender studies department, so maybe it's because of the traffic that they might be receiving, because there's a lot of like applications coming on in. But the form that you fill in that website, they ask you for a potential supervisor that you identified and given their name. So maybe.
And that is the university form. The university form requires you to, not requires you, but allows you to put down the name of an advisor, of a supervisor. At any rate, Maria, why don't you just drop me an email, and then when everybody's back at work, I will try and reach out to gender studies and ask what the situation is. But forgive my ignorance. I was not aware that they told you not to be in touch.
Thank you so much. I will do that.
Great. Anahita?
Hi, thank you for the session. I actually have a question regarding references. Like when we ask, like, for example, our professors to write reference letters. I finished my master's in 2017, so it's been like quite a long time since that, and I've been working since then. So I wanted to know if there's can I ask like the people I've worked with to write my reference letters, or is it just or it just has to be specifically my professors? Because I'm not sure how much of me do they remember because considering how much time has passed.
Okay, I think this is a good and interesting question, and we do often get references from work bosses. The truth is that those references, unless they are from somebody working let us say you work on gender studies, right? And you have worked in an NGO that does women's rights. That letter has a certain use, right? Because you've been working in a cognate field. But let's say you have worked at a call center and you want to do a PhD in history. That boss can really only say, well, this person turns up for work and they're a very committed worker. That person can't tell us very much about you as a scholar. So I would say that, look, at least 2 references should be from professors who have known you in some context. You can remind them. I mean, I do get letters from students who I taught 2 years ago, and then I say to them, okay, send me your CV, show me your application letter, and send me a list of things that you think I should think about while writing your letter. But it is difficult for academic admissions committees to base their judgment on the word of somebody who is not familiar with your academic work.
Okay, that makes sense. Actually, I've been working with, over the past years, I've been working with 2 different organizations, and most of my work is research-based. In one organization, it's history, it's mostly oral history, and the other, it was a it was an anti-sex trafficking organization. So, I mean, that'll work, right? I mean, that.
Yeah, but not
work.
all your letters. I would say, out of 3
Obviously.
letters, one, yeah, absolutely. There should be some academic content to the letters.
Okay, thank you.
Rizwan?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I just have a couple of quick questions. The first one about the grades. So do they just take into account your grades from your bachelor's degree, or just your master's degree, or both? Because I did pretty well for my bachelor's, but I mean the master's, it was all right, but not as high as I expected. So yeah, that's the first question. And the second question is, when it comes to writing samples that you submit. So is it, would you just recommend assignments that you've authored in which you got good grades, or perhaps, I've authored a couple of journal articles. Do you think that may come in handy? Even though
totally.
It might be quite tough, even though it might
Totally.
be.
A journal article will be an extra tick mark next to your name. So my main advice is give them your best, but it is not at all necessary to do a marked assignment. In fact, marked assignments typically will have to be revised. When I applied, I studied in the US. So when I first applied to the US, I wrote an entire article that nobody looked at, that I just wrote because I didn't have any suitable work. I was shifting fields. I did linguistics at JNU, and then I was moving back to literature. And I didn't have any papers from the linguistics department that an English department could make head or tail of. So I simply wrote a separate article. And if like you, if I had something published and I thought it was a good reflection of my abilities, absolutely send that in. The first question, they're going to look at your entire academic record. They are going to see how it looks as a field. They are typically also going to look for evidence of an upward trajectory. Okay, so people, doing not so well in their second year, but doing better in their third year, that's encouraging because that shows the person has growth capacity. But if there is something that you feel is anomalous, either in your BA or your MA, it is something that you can ask your referees to explain. I'm fairly sure that my referees would have said, look, her exam marks simply do not reflect her ability. Okay, so at that point, a department will say, okay, look, the referees actually think that this person is more intelligent than a bad mark in an exam might look like. So all is not lost if there is a kind of blip in your academic record, but do ask your referees to address it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. That's a very interesting question. I'd like to build on that. There are some cases that I've come across personally as well, that the students, they've been phenomenal throughout, like in the school, in the undergrads, but in the masters, once they came into the UK academia, we know it's altogether different from our educational system where we come from. So learning that, understanding that, and also like those who come here recently, they were in the lockdown and had to go to the classes online. So they couldn't have the real interaction and understand the things. When doing the master's dissertation with the academic styles and imbibing those things and then reflecting them on the paper, many of them couldn't do it, also because of the trauma that they had to suffer or go through. Like, you're coming to a new country, then you're living altogether secluded, you don't have those interactions, attending the classes remotely, so their grades suffer. Maybe some of them like get in their 50s, whereas like they are like really intelligent people who actually had distinctions or ranks and up to their undergrads. So when they try to apply to many institutions like the Oxbridge, they aren't eligible because sadly, they couldn't have the merit that they require, that the baseline. What do you suggest to those students? We've come across those cases and it has had a tremendous impact on their self-confidence.
Yeah. That's a tough one, to be honest. What I will say is that in the reference letters I've been writing, I have stressed that that work was done under pandemic conditions. It was done without access to library resources. And I do think that academic institutions will take into account that the last 2 years of admissions or the incoming admissions are all people who have done their master's or their final year bachelor's under really unprecedented circumstances. Unfortunately, I don't think that the 2-1 rule that Cambridge and I think Oxford have is waivable because it doesn't come from the department. That rule comes from the university. I'm going to say something that I think is worth saying. It's fine if you get into Oxford and Cambridge, but they are not the be all and end all. Okay, for one thing, I have had students with PhDs from Cambridge not get the job that somebody from another less prestigious institution did get. Okay, so I think it's quite important to be ambitious, but not to be broken if you don't get into your main institution. I just advised one of my PhD students who's applying to, one of my MPhil students who's applying to the US, not to put all their eggs in the Ivy basket, okay? Because these are institutions that can have their pick. I mean, it is their market. They can slice off the top layer and not admit some fabulous people. So what I told them, the student, is please apply to the next rung of universities. Your life is not broken if you go to the University of Pittsburgh, or if you go to Exeter, or you go to Warwick. All very, very high-ranking institutions in their own right. They might not have Ivy or Oxbridge, but don't assume that just because you didn't go to Cambridge, you don't have an academic career. That is simply statistically not the case. Okay, and I know people with PhDs from Oxford and Cambridge, as I said, who don't necessarily make the cut. So I think it's quite important to be realistic about your record and to say, okay, fine, I can't apply to such and such institution because they can demand a first class, but I can apply to such and such institution, which actually has a very interesting person working in a cognate field. So I know that the ideal answer I would give you would be, well, never mind, just apply anyway. Even if the department said we want this person, the graduate school would say, sorry, no can do. Okay. That said, I think institutions are making allowances for what happened. So if the last year is a blip, or the last couple of years is a blip, and that can be explained by a referee and by yourself, it might be worth applying anyway.
That's really helpful, and maybe a booster for the students as well, because I've talked to a couple of students who've suffered these things, and knowing their potential and having been into the merit list all the time, and suddenly they're plummeting to lower levels. It's a very big disappointment for them, and maybe this really helps them. Thank you so very much. If we have any other questions, please go ahead, raise your hands. I think we don't have any further questions. Professor, would you like to say something to wrap up the session?
Look, I guess what I will say is it's been a very difficult couple of years, and everybody's research has suffered, including full-time senior academics. We've all done much less than we could. It will pass, and if there is a blip and you have to take a year off, or you do badly, and you have to rethink your plans, so be it. It is something that we all have to deal with, and we're all making life decisions now that we didn't think we would be making 2 years ago. The pandemic has done that for us. I would also say something that I do say to my own students. Your generation coming in, by all means, reach out for an academic career, but have a plan B. I think in a way that was not true for my generation. Your generation should think about options outside of straightforward academia. Not least because academia is under attack from multiple quarters, political, economic. The pandemic is going to weaken a lot of universities financially. We don't know. We don't know what things will look like 3 years down the line. You can always do research and thinking in other fields. So by all means, aspire for academia, by all means, aspire to do research, but don't put all your eggs in that basket. Given the uncertain times in which we all live, we all need a plan B. So keep a plan B in your mind. And remember that whatever you end up doing, nobody can stop you from reading and thinking. And that's the fundamental skill that you can, in a sense, preserve wherever you end up and whatever happens in terms of specific institutional decisions.
Thank you so very much. So I can see one hand raised. It's from Masuma. Masuma, if you have a question, please go ahead.
Hi, Professor. So you mentioned of writing samples. Is it necessary that the sample should be in accordance with the research topic? Because I've done my master's in English, but I'm applying in politics. So what do you say about it?
Yeah, so very good question. I'm glad you asked that. Ideally, it is in the same field. I've looked at samples which have the opposite. So somebody has a degree from, let us say, a kind of quantitative field. Okay, so let's say political science. And they send a paper in, and I have no way of judging whether they can write a chapter in a literature dissertation. You can do it. I do know that admissions committees spend a lot of time saying to each other, but can this person write a literary essay? I would say if you can do a paper that is more suited to that field, then do that. You can take the chance that a committee will say, oh my God, this is so brilliant. I'm sure they could do a chapter in literature or a chapter in history. But I think the cannier thing to do would be to give something that is as close to that field as possible. That is the honest answer, because otherwise committees will say, well, we have no way of judging.
All right,
sorry, does that answer your question? Did you want to come back on that?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so very much. We had a question in the chat. I sent that to you as well. It's, hi, I just want to ask, what would 2 to 1 mean in the US grade credits? Is it equal to A or A minus?
I think, I don't want to speak for the US system because it's been a long time since I taught in that system. But I know that we take A minus on US transcripts as a 2-1. So it would be somewhere between a B plus and an A minus on that range, depending on the actual mark. So a mark of A minus, we would probably interpret that as on the borderline of a first. A mark of a B plus, we would interpret that as solidly 2-1. Different institutions have different scales. And so I don't want to speak for a particular institution.
Yeah, I think that settles all the questions. Thank you so very much, Professor, for joining us for your time. Really, it has been really enriching. Thank you so very much.
Good luck, everyone.
Thank you so much. It was really nice having you.
You're welcome. Good to meet you all. Bye.